Taylor on Aristotle's philosophy, and we're still looking at the cause of gravity and levity, or the causes. We got a few interesting ideas out of this section. The location of something ends up, or the proper location ends up being part of its form, or its identity. Okay, and that can account for some of the kind of causal power of the center and outward extremity, the same being drawn to the same. But okay, let's go back a little bit. So the heavy and light, however, appear more than these to possess in themselves the principle of mutation, because the matter of these is most near to essence. Right. So we looked at that. I think we're going to review this footnote, and it'll go over what is meant by most near to essence. We had a couple speculations. I think I preferred my idea of what Aristotle meant to what Simplicius offered, but we'll review that. So the thinking that I had was that it was the like most elementary type of mutation, local motion, and so it, let's see, came from itself rather than being caused by another. Alright, I would have to review more to get back into this. Let's just go ahead and get to that footnote, and that'll spark our memory here. A token of which is this, that lation belongs to things that are entire and complete. So it's like the last of the things that'll change, and is last in the generation of motions, so that this motion will be the first, and according to essence. So it's the least change that is required of a thing. So it's that principle of local motion is most from the essence of a thing, because the essence doesn't need to change in any way. Its properties don't need to change. It's just changing its location is all. And that flows from all of these other properties which, with respect to local motion, are not being changed. Okay, but let's review this footnote. All right. Having shown that bodies which naturally tend upward and downward tend as to their proper form and perfection, because their final location is part of their form, and from a subsistence in capacity to a subsistence in energy, of which they possess the capacity, he now also confirms this from other motions. He shows, therefore, that as in other motions, the mutation according to nature from that which is in capacity to the characteristic property of accidents is into something else, the like also takes place in local motion. But having said that things which are changed into health from themselves require a little external cooperation, he adds that that which may be restored to health, and that which is susceptible of disease are the same thing, on which account if it is moved so far as it may be restored to health, it tends to health, but if so far as it may be diseased, it tends to disease. For everything is moved to that to which it possesses the power of being moved. Collecting, therefore, that bodies which are locally moved, for these are the heavy and the light, have the principle of motion in themselves more than other things which are naturally moved, he adds the cause why bodies which are locally moved are more perfect. For being now more perfect in energy, they more contain in themselves the principle of motion. So they're closer to their total final goal, whereas something that has to be restored to health or changed in quality is alienated more from its natural perfection, and so being closer to its natural perfection, they contain in itself the principle of motion more, which I guess makes sense. Like they're closer to their proper nature. Nature is a principle of motion, whereas something that's deranged from its proper nature doesn't necessarily have its own principle of motion and requires external assistance, reasoning something like that. For on this account, in short, animated natures, being more perfect than others, especially abound with the power of being moved by themselves. Right. So a soul is the entelechy, or like actualized potential of a body, of a living body, and that actualized potential is actualization of form. And so to be animated is to basically instantiate or actualize your form to a greater extent than other things. So they too, animated bodies, will have their own principle of motion by virtue of the fact that they are complete in that way, actualized. And so the basic elements have their principle of motion because they're basically complete. They just aren't where they're finally supposed to be yet. For that which is imperfect and has not yet a being is moved by this, by which also it is generated. Okay. But he adds, yeah, so imperfect things will be passive, more perfect things will be active. But he adds the cause of that which is locally moved being more perfect, viz., because the matter of things thus moved is most near to essence, obscurely signifying the cause, for he calls matter the aptitude of these, and that which is incapacity. But the form, which is perfective of them, essence. Right. So local motion is most near to essence. It's not material, it's more formal. For everything which is incapacity is matter with respect to that which is in with respect to that to which it is incapacity, and the essence of everything is defined according to the form which is perfective of it. Since, therefore, things which are locally moved are not changed according to anything which is inherent in them, but according to place alone, hence things which are now essentially perfect are near to local motion. For the aptitude according to local motion proceeds not as to essence, but as to energy. So it's not an essential change, just a change in its external acts, on which account also divine bodies do not disdain to be moved with this motion, because it possesses much of an efficacious nature. So it's more an outward act, not a inward potency for being changed. For to be changed in quality and increased, and still farther to be generated, are rather passions than energies, but local motion is rather energy than passion. Hence things which are locally moved, so far indeed as they are moved, have not yet acquired the perfection pertaining to this motion, if they are moved to the full perfection and form of themselves according to this, but having arrived at their own place through local motion, they acquire from this their own perfection, becoming that in energy which they were formerly in capacity alone. Okay, so actually, no, I perfectly agree with Simplicius's account of what Aristotle meant there. I think I was thinking of another discrepancy, but yeah, this all tracks. So Aristotle, therefore, very properly says that the aptitude of these is most near to essence, since being essentially perfect, they require to energize alone. And if they obtain this through motion from themselves, they require no other motion. But that they are near to perfection and more perfect than things which are moved in a different manner, he adduces two signs. One, that such a motion is the motion of things complete, that is, of things which are entire essentially, and not so according to any one of the things which are changed in them. For things which are passing into existence, which are increasing and changing in quality, are not yet complete with respect to a subsistence by themselves. In the second place, he infers this from things which are locally moved, being the last in generation, but things which are last in generation are more perfect. Yeah, so we did hit this last time, and we were kind of looking at exceptions to that rule. We can see in some cases where it is the case that maturation, development takes time, and so the mature, perfect specimen will be later in time. But then with an eternal cosmology, a cyclical cosmology, it's hard to say that in general what is later is better. But at least in certain respects, the last things will be the most complete. I guess, okay, well, here's a Aristotelian type fine distinction we could apply here. So the things that are last specifically in generation, not in the world of generation. The world of generation is composed of generation and corruption. So I guess the meaning might be that the things that are last in the generation phase of generation corruption are more perfect, which is true. For in animals, things imperfect precede the perfect in generation, viz. The seed and menstruum, the gradual formation of the embryo, and that which is just born precede the perfection which the animal acquires in time. And in a similar manner in plants, each proceeds from the imperfect to the perfect. But that which is more perfect is prior in essence, as if for the sake of this, other things were pre-assumed. Local motion also is posterior to other motions both in animals and in inanimate natures, for animals, when they are now perfect, are moved according to place, and natural bodies, when perfect, acquire their natural local motion, fire indeed when it tends to the extremity, but earth when it tends to the middle. But change in quality precedes, and after this increase, and thus the motion according to place accedes, and especially in more perfect natures, such as animals. For these, when now perfect and complete, are moved for the local motion adapted to animals. Hence local motion will be the first, according to essence, arriving posterior to other motions, both in time and order. Okay, so it is closest to a complete being to move locally. A sick person doesn't move until they become healthy, and then they can start moving again, or that sort of thing. Or of course, the embryo doesn't do a lot of local moving until it's complete. All right. Aristotle, when therefore air is generated from water and the light from the heavy, it arrives at the upward place. At the same time, however, it is light and is no longer generated, but is there. It is evident, therefore, that being in capacity and proceeding to energy, it arrives there and becomes so much in quantity and such in quality as it is adapted to possess in energy. Okay, so he's saying when air is generated from water and the light from the heavy, it arrives at the upward place. So after the aliation, change in quality has taken place, then it will proceed to its local motion appropriate to it. Being in capacity and proceeding to energy, it arrives there and becomes so much in quantity and such in quality as it is adapted to possess in energy. There is also the same cause why earth and fire are now moved to their own places when nothing impedes. For nutriment, when that which impedes and that which may be restored to health, when that which detains is removed, are immediately moved. Okay, let's look at the footnote. Aristotle, having observed that things which are moved to their own place are moved to their own form and perfection, delivers to us the distinction between things which are moved with their own motion in being generated and in changing form, a subsistence in capacity to a subsistence in energy, and things which now are. So he's just outlining the difference between aliation, change in quantity, and all of that with respect to local motion. He says, therefore, that when air is generated from water, and in short, the light from something heavy, it arrives at the upward place, but at the same time, together with receiving form and becoming perfectly light, it is no longer generated light, but is so. If, therefore, that is now light, which has emerged on high, it is evident that what is light in capacity and proceeds to a perfect energy is moved to the upward place. Okay. Well, I guess what I'm getting now is that the local motion is just one of the qualities. It's like the last and least essential, although closer to essence in the sense that Simplicius is interpreting Aristotle here. It's just like one of those things that can change about the thing. So since the light body is that which is now light is on high, then when you proceed to become a light body, you will move to the upward place, as that's just the last of the properties that you'll obtain when you go through this change from, say, water to air. That's how it seems to me. But there it has a subsistence in energy. But having observed concerning things which are locally moved, that proceeding according to energy they arrive thither, he briefly adds also concerning other motions, that things according to quantity become so much, and according to quality such as they are adapted to be in energy. For instance, they become 2 cubits in length, and they become white. Having, however, spoken concerning things which are generated, he adds also concerning things which are now in energy, about that which is now fire, and that which is now earth, that in these also there is the same cause why they are moved to their own place when nothing impedes. So he talked about when something becomes one of the other elements, it's going to aspire to that local place proper to the element. But things that are currently the element already, why do they move to their own place? When nothing impedes, well, he's going to expand on that thought. For things which are in energy, and which are detained by violence in a foreign place, or are generated in a substance, generated in a subject in a foreign place, as fire which is enkindled here, or a stone which is formed in the clouds, these also, when nothing impedes, tend to the place naturally adapted to them, in which they arrive at it, they acquire the perfection of their form. For whether they are in a foreign place on this account because they were there generated, they still partake in a certain respect of a contrary nature from which they were changed, and which they lay aside when they arrive at their proper places. Or whether, so like if a stone was generated in the clouds, it has something of the nature of the clouds still until it moves to the earth. So it still has the place that belongs properly to the clouds. So after the rest of the changes take place, well, then the stone will want to complete its natural perfection and move to the earth. Or whether they are detained by violence in a foreign place, they thus also they are in a certain respect disposed contrary to nature. So whenever you remove the impediment, a violent motion, of course, is just motion contrary to nature. So you remove the being detained by violence, and it'll move to its natural place. For that which is not naturally adapted to emerge above, if it is compelled to surpass and rise above other bodies, is then disposed contrary to nature. Hence, things which now are seen to be in energy, when they are in foreign places, are in a certain respect imperfect, have something in capacity, are moved to that which is in energy, and are led to the perfect. That Aristotle indeed is of opinion that things which now appear to be in energy have, when impeded, something in capacity, he evinces by adding that nutriment and that which may be restored to health, when that which impedes is removed, tend to the subsistence of themselves in energy, as yet being in capacity. So alienation, also change in quality, if there's something preventing the natural state of a thing, when you remove that, so it's not just local motion that can be violently impeded, but also the natural quality that a thing should have. For nutriment, when it is in energy, that which it was in capacity, for instance, when it is flesh, then it makes an addition and nourishes and increases that of which it is said to be the nutriment. There is a great difference, however, with respect to subsistence in capacity, in that which is now generated, and in that which has not yet received form. For the latter is like grammar in a boy, but the former is like the capacity in one who possesses the grammatical habit, but does not energize according to it. Okay. Just the difference between a natural ability in capacity versus one that is actualized. And of this kind is the subsistence in capacity of that which may be locally moved. Aristotle also seems through this to solve the objection which says, if that which tends, so I guess the dual form of potency, a boy who knows grammar has the potential of being grammatical more immediately because internally he's already how he needs to be in order to energize grammatically, versus the kid who could learn grammar and so is potentially grammatical but further removed from the actualization of grammar than one who already knows it but isn't like currently speaking. Aristotle also seems through this to solve the objection, which says, if that which tends to its proper place according to nature tends to its proper form, why does that which has now received its proper form tend to its proper place? And he says that the body which is locally moved perfectly receives its proper form when it becomes situated in its proper place. Okay, so basically the only explanation he's giving of why things move is that to where they ought to be is that they're seeking their natural perfection, which, okay. All right, let's read this sentence again and then go on. For nutriment, when that which impedes and that which may be restored to health, when that which detains is removed, are immediately moved. And that moves indeed, which made from the beginning, and that which removes the impediment. Sorry, let me see. So the thing that moves is that which made from the beginning, and that which removes the impediment, or whence it leaps back, as was said in the first discussion, in what we proved that no one of these moves itself. And thus we have shown through what cause each of the things that are locally moved is so, and what it is for a body to be moved to its own place. Okay, I think that was a pretty obscure sentence. I think it was just saying that the natural tendency of the body is that which moves it, not the removal of the impediment. But maybe Simplicius will clarify. And again, this isn't pure Simplicius in the footnotes. This is Taylor paraphrasing Simplicius, but I think it like slips in and out of direct quotation, as far as I can tell. Okay, so footnote 7. Having observed that things which are locally moved contain in themselves the principle of motion more than things which are moved in a different manner, he makes the reader observe that this is said as with reference to a comparison with other things which are moved according to quantity and quality, than which things that are locally moved are more perfect, because even these have not properly in themselves the principle of motion. But in these also, that which is asserted in the 8th book of the Physics is true, that nothing which is moved naturally moves itself, but everything which is thus moved is moved by something else. Okay, so I guess that sentence wasn't saying that it's the thing that moves in a natural direction once the impediment is removed, that it's actually not the thing which moves itself. It has the natural principle of motion or natural tendency of motion, but perhaps he's saying that the thing that truly moves is the maker of the thing that has a natural locomotion. So the maker of fire, which gives it the natural disposition to move on high, is that which moves it, rather than it truly moving itself. Because self-motion is a property of animated natures, and so the natural bodies which have a natural tendency to motion, they seem to be self-moved. They have the principle of motion in themselves, but maybe they themselves are not the mover, we should say. So he says that nothing which is moved naturally moves itself, but everything which is thus moved is moved by something else. So that convoluted sentence was to like accord with what he says in the Physics and clarify that he's not talking about genuine self-motion, but just that natural bodies are the closest to self-motion compared to other changes in quality, etc. He also calls his Physics the first discussions as being employed about natural principles. He says, therefore, that things which are locally moved are moved by another. For all things are moved by that which made them from the beginning, and which through generation imparts to them gravity and levity. If anything, however, prevents their tendency, as for instance the tendency of fire upward or of earth downward, that which removes the impediment is the cause of their motion, but is a cause according to accident. So accidentally, if you remove an impediment which allows a heavy body to fall downward, you are the cause of motion, so to speak, but not the essential cause of motion. The essential cause of the motion is the creator of the matter in question. or the simple body in question. That also, says he, from whence a thing leaps back, moves it in a certain respect, as the wall moves a rebounding stone or a ball. Okay, so impediments to natural motion, or that lead to, yeah, like a bouncing ball or things bouncing into each other, they do move the other objects in a certain respect, but probably still it's like accidentally they move it. Simplicius adds, see, this is what I mean by Taylor is paraphrasing. It's really not clear exactly what's Simplicius and what's Taylor. Simplicius adds that it is necessary, however, to consider whether such a motion as this is natural and simple, for it is neither an upward nor a downward, but a lateral motion. So like a bouncing ball or something like that, that kind of motion. Is it natural and simple, or what kind of motion is it? Thus, therefore, that which was just before proposed is concluded and demonstrated, viz., why some bodies always naturally tend upward, but others naturally tend downward, and others tend both upward and downward. For he shows that a body which is moved to its proper place is moved to its proper form and perfection, and that it is the same thing to inquire why fire tends upward, but earth downward, as it is to inquire why that which may be restored to health, if it is moved and changed so far as it may be restored to health, arrives at health and not at whiteness. So that question of the other types of motion, I feel like, is just raised but not really addressed yet. Maybe we'll look at other types of natural local motion aside from just the tendency to raise and fall. Of course, rising and falling are the par excellence natural motions of simple bodies outside of the heavenly bodies, which naturally move in a circle for reasons that we have already looked at in a previous section. Okay, so we'll keep going. Let us, however, Aristotle, now speak of the differences and the accidents which subsist about them. Let it therefore, in the first place, be defined, as it appears to all men, that the simply heavy is that which subsists under all things, but the simply light, that which emerges above all things. But I say simply, looking to the genus and to those things in which both these are not inherent. Right. So not some particular species of lightness or heaviness, but lightness, heaviness, simply, and not those things which have a mix of the heavy and the light, but which are those extremes by themselves, simply. Thus, for instance, any casual magnitude of fire is seen tending on high unless any other thing should happen to prevent it, and of earth tending downward. After the same manner also, that which is more in quantity is more swiftly moved. But those things are in another respect heavy and light, in which both these are inherent. Okay. So things can be heavy and light if they possess the natures both of fire and earth. And it's interesting, he seems to be saying that a great quantity of fire, like a giant ball of fire, would ascend more swiftly than a small ball of fire, and a great mass of earth would descend more quickly than a small mass of earth. And I think that is Aristotle's position, which is, of course, wrong, but I wonder what the reasoning is. For they emerge, I think he's talking about the mixed bodies now. Those things are different than those which are heavy and light in some mixture. For they emerge above and subsist under certain things, just as air and water, the intermediate elements, since neither of these is simply light or heavy. For both are lighter than earth, since any casual part of them emerges above it, but they are heavier than fire, for any part whatever of them subsists under it. With reference to themselves, however, one is simply heavy and the other simply light. So when comparing the two, for air, of whatever magnitude it may be, always emerges above water, and water, of whatever magnitude it may be, subsists under air. But since of other things some have gravity and others levity, it is evident that the cause of all these is the difference which there is in simple natures. For in consequence of one thing obtaining more and another less of these, some bodies will be light and others heavy. Hence we must speak about these, for the rest follow the first, which also we say those ought to do who assert that the heavy subsists through a plenum and the light through a vacuum. So it sounds like he's saying we need more explanation here, the same sort of explanation we would ask those who, through a competing theory, explain the heavy and light through a plenum and vacuum, which would come from the school of Anaximenes. I think he was the first to propose that. All right. But it happens that the same things do not everywhere appear to be heavy and light on account of the difference of the first or simple bodies. Okay, so there are other complex causal factors involved that we're going to look at. I say, for instance, wood of 100-pound weight will be heavier in air than lead of 1-pound weight, but will be lighter than the lead in water. Right. But this is because all things have gravity except fire, and levity except earth. It is necessary, therefore, that earth and such things as contain most of earth should everywhere have gravity, that water should everywhere have gravity except in earth, and air except in water and earth. For all things, even air itself, have gravity in their own place except fire, of which this is a token that bladders, when inflated, are heavier than when empty. Okay. Does anyone in the Jitsi call want to try to explain then, using that reasoning, why Aristotle would say the log is heavier in air, but the ball of iron is heavier in water? Okay. I guess because the log will be a mixture of water and earth, and so it won't be heavier in water due to the water in itself. It will only be heavier than water due to the earth in itself. So a small mass of iron, which may have no water admixed, it's just pure earth, will be totally heavier than the water, but the log, which consists of water as well, won't, by virtue of the water, be heavier than the water. Okay, it is necessary, therefore, that earth and such things as contain most of earth should everywhere have gravity, that water should everywhere have gravity except in earth, and air except in water and earth. For all things, even air itself, have gravity in their own place except fire, of which this is a token that bladders, when inflated, are heavier than when empty. Hence, if anything has more of air than of earth and water, in water it may be lighter than something else, but in air heavier. For it does not swim upon air, but it swims upon water. Okay, so long footnote. Footnote 8. Ptolemy, the mathematician, says Simplicius, in his book on Momenta, or the inclinations of bodies, having an opinion contrary to Aristotle, endeavors to prove that neither water nor air have any gravity in their own places, and that water indeed has not. He shows from this. So I wonder if Simplicius is going to defend Aristotle or endorse Ptolemy. And that water indeed has not, he shows from this, that those who merge themselves in it do not perceive the weight of the superincumbent water, though many have descended into it to a great depth. Of course, I mean, if you went far enough, the water would crush you. Just, you can't swim that far. To this, however, it may be said that the continuity of the superincumbent and subjacent water, and of that which subsists on each side, cause its weight not to be perceived. Right. So the same as really Anaximander's argument as to why the Earth maintains its position in the middle. Same reason that Plato gives for why the Earth maintains its position in the middle, because there's no one imbalance of force from any side because it's surrounded by nothing. So here we're surrounded by water on all sides, so you don't perceive the weight of the water above. For thus, in the cavities of walls, although that doesn't exactly work here, I think. For thus, in the cavities of walls, those animals which touch the walls on all sides are not oppressed with its weight, because the wall sustains itself in every part. Hence, if the water, being divided, should recede, it is probable I'm not sure what the example is of the animal that touches the walls on all sides. Like a burrowing animal, well, shouldn't be crushed by the earth, but no, the earth like holds up the cavity that it's in, I guess. Hence, if the water being divided should recede, it is probable that he who is merged in it would have a sensible perception of its weight. That air, well, yeah, so like if the water under you disappeared, then you would feel the weight of the water. That air also has not any weight in its wholeness, Ptolemy shows from the same argument in bladders, not only contradicting the opinion of Aristotle, viz. that an inflated bladder is heavier than one that is not inflated, but also wishing to prove that it becomes lighter when inflated. Simplicius adds that he, however, found, from the most accurate experiment he was able to make, that an inflated bladder had the same weight with one that was not inflated, and that a certain person, also prior to his time, writes that he found they had very nearly the same weight, but that the bladder, prior to its being inflated, was rather heavier, which accords with what Ptolemy says. So we have contradicting reports. What's the experimental data here? It's not clear. It is evident, therefore, if this experiment may be depended on, that the elements will be without a momentum in their proper places, none of them having either gravity or levity, which Ptolemy acknowledges to be the case with water. And there will indeed be some reason in this, for if natural momentum or tendency is the desire of a proper place, the body which has obtained this place will no longer aspire after it, nor being in it, will verge to it, just as neither does that which is satiated desire food. Okay. So Ptolemy's claim was that water and air have no gravity or levity in themselves, and Simplicius is countering that, well, they have no gravity or levity in their proper place because they're already in their proper place. But if, as Ptolemy says, an inflated bladder is lighter than one which is not inflated, air will have levity in its own place, and it will also follow from the same reasoning that water in its own place will have weight. For when we emerge from water, I want to review to see for sure what Ptolemy says. No, Ptolemy's position is that they don't have gravity or levity in their own places. So Simplicius is agreeing with Ptolemy still. For when we emerge from water, we seem to throw off a certain weight, unless perhaps by recovering the air, which is the basis of respiration, we have a sensation of the deposition of weight from the strength of this. Because when we get out, we take on more air, and so we feel like we're losing the weight of the water. I mean, whether water has weight should seem, I mean, it seems like it should be so trivial. In air, obviously it does. You can carry a bucket of water, it's heavy. Um, in short, if air is to water as the simply light to the simply heavy, it is reasonable that the air should be more allied to the simply light, and that in its proper place it should have levity, as well as fire, and that water should have weight through its alliance to earth. For these have a certain difference, and on this account necessarily thus subsist. Hence, if any one compares these two alone with each other, air must be said to be simply light, but water simply heavy, as Aristotle himself teaches us, so that air will alone have weight in fire, than which it is heavier, but water will have levity alone in earth, because it is lighter than it. And again, air in itself, and in those things prior to it, will have weight, but water in itself, and in that which is under it, will have levity. These things, however, are asserted conformably to the greatest of philosophers, Syrianus, the preceptor of Proclus. Perhaps, however, if these assertions are true, air may be said to be light in the elements posterior to it in one way, and in its own region in another way. So it's interesting that Simplicius calls Syrianus the greatest of philosophers. That is pretty interesting, because Syrianus, the one surviving work we have is on Aristotle's Metaphysics by him, and I didn't read it myself yet, we will eventually in this group, but he apparently is really critical of Aristotle. So Simplicius is constantly working to make them compatible. Simplicius wants to make them agree. Syrianus seems to be attacking Aristotle. And yet Simplicius finds Syrianus to be the greatest of philosophers. Perhaps, however, if these assertions are true, air may be said to be light in the elements posterior to it in one way, and in its own region in another way. In the other elements it may be said to be light, as tending from them to the upward region, but in its own region as emerging above them, but not as tending from them upward. And it is necessary that this should be said by those who think that an inflated bladder is lighter than one which is not inflated. For how, in short, is it possible to call air in its own place light, in the same manner as that which is naturally moved upward? For it does not wish to depart from its proper place. But if an inflated bladder weighs less than one not inflated, neither does this compel the elements to have a certain momentum in their own place, but it rather shows the non-inclination of them. So he's like, well, it may be the case that an inflated bladder weighs less. He's agnostic on the empirical data, which is inconclusive as of his time. And he's like, well, it doesn't show that the air tends upward. Maybe he's going to say it shows that, like, well, the earth is less predominant in it, so by itself, the predominant earth is going to sink relative to air more than if it's a mixture of air and water. For the air in a bladder detains the bladder in its own place, but the bladder, at the same time falling, i.e. not being inflated, having a terrestrial condition, and a privation of air, verges more downward. Thus also wood falling upon water, becoming situated according to a certain part of itself in the place of air, and air receding into itself, establishes the earthly nature, which is in itself in the region of air. That air, however, has weight in its own region, so as that on this account an inflated bladder draws more air will be very dubious. For if this be admitted, so there was one experimental report that suggested the inflated one weighed very slightly more, I think, and he's like, well, that's very dubious because that would be contrary to principle. I could be getting that anecdote wrong, though. It might be the other way that it was reported. For if this be admitted, air in its own place will naturally verge downward, which is absurd, and appeared to be so to Aristotle. Simplicius concludes with observing that since Aristotle says an inflated bladder weighs more than one not inflated, it is not easy to reject the judgment of a man so accurate, and that perhaps the air which is injected into the bladder from the mouth, becoming more moist from a copious inflation, and compressed by the continuance of the inflation, adds some little weight to it. For this may be said by him who does not despise so great a man on account of his accuracy. So, with respect to Ptolemy, what may have happened is that there's some moisture in the air that you're putting in there, and that's what accounts for the increased gravity of the inflated bladder, if in fact that is the experimental result. So interesting. Simplicius, always conciliatory, trying to have all these great men agree. Okay. Aristotle, that there is therefore something simply heavy and something simply light is from these things evident. But I call that simply light which is always naturally adapted to tend upward, and that simply heavy which is always naturally adapted to tend downward, unless something impedes. For there are certain things of this kind, and all things are not, as some fancy, heavy. For, funny, I wonder who fancies that, because they're, in a certain respect, closer to the truth, of course, universal gravitation and all. For to certain other persons also there appears to be that which is heavy, and that it always tends to the middle, and in a similar manner there is also that which is light. For we see, as we have before observed, that earthly natures are placed under all things and tend to the middle. The middle, however, is defined. If therefore there is anything which emerges above all things, as fire appears in the air itself to tend upward, but the air is at rest, if this be the case, it is evident that fire tends to the extremity, so that it cannot have any weight, since if it had, it would be placed under something else. But if this were the case, there would be something else which would tend to the extremity, and which would emerge above everything that is moved. Now, however, no such thing is seen. Fire, therefore, has no weight. Interesting. But couldn't you just say that fire has the least weight, but all things have weight? Because his argument is that, oh, well, there would be something even lighter if fire had any weight at all. But why do we have to believe that there is anything with no weight? According to all his principles, like everything would move the same way. Anyway, fire therefore has no weight, nor has earth any levity, since it is placed under everything, and that which subsides tends to the middle. Alright, footnote 9. One of the elements, says Aristotle, is simply heavy, and one is simply light, and all things have not gravity, as Democritus and his followers thought. So that's Democritus. Nothing, however, hinders but that fire and all the other elements may have gravity of such a kind as Plato says is the cause to each of them of their tendency to their proper place. For Plato, as has been before observed, calls such a tendency gravity, differing from Aristotle only in the name, because he calls the tendency to the middle gravity, denominating the middle the downward place, but the tendency to the circumambient levity, conformably to the custom of the multitude. So Aristotle distinguishes gravity versus levity. Plato calls attraction gravity. Okay. Moreover, that there is a middle to which the lation of things that are heavy tends, and from which things that are light are moved, is multifariously evident. In the first place, because nothing can be moved to infinity, for as nothing which is impossible is, so neither can it be generated. But lation is generation from one boundary to another. But lation is generation from one boundary to another. So not from the infinite to the infinite, because an actualized infinity is impossible, so it has to be from a fixed limit to a fixed limit. In the next place, fire tends upward, but earth downward, according to similar angles, and this is the case with everything which is heavy, so that it is necessary there should be a tendency to the middle, but whether this tendency happens to be the middle of the earth or to the middle of the universe, since they are the same, is the business of another discussion. Since, however, that which is placed under all things tends to the middle, we've looked at that discussion before as to why there is one earth. The main argument was that, well, if there were multiple earths, then earth, which is the same everywhere, would tend in multiple directions, but it tends in one, therefore there is one world. Since, however, that which is placed under all things tends to the middle, that which emerges above all things must necessarily tend to the extremity of the place in which bodies are moved. For the middle is contrary to the extremity, and that which is always placed under to that which is always placed above. Hence, the heavy and the light may be reasonably admitted to be two things, for there are also two places, the middle and the extremity. That also which subsists between these is something which is denominated another with reference to each of these. For that which is between is as the extremity and middle of both. On this account also there is something else which is heavy and light, as for instance air and water. So heavy and light in a secondary sense, not absolute heavy, absolute light. But we say that that which contains has the relation of form, and that which is contained of matter, and this difference is in all the genre of things. For in quality and in quantity, one thing is rather as form, but another as matter. In like manner also in things pertaining to place, that which is upward belongs to the definite, but that which is downward to matter. Hence, in the matter itself of the heavy, so remember we had that explanation of the seeming discrepancy. If the containing is always more formal, but a thing going to its proper place is going to its proper form, then earth and the downward and the upward end up being more formal, and a concentric ring cosmology just seems to be argued against in some sense, unless you say that, well, the downward contains in a certain respect, but not in the literal sense that the ring outward does. And here he's using language also that reflects that the outward ring, the upward, is always more formal. That which is downward to matter. Yeah, he's asserting that very plainly. And so the explanation they gave before was that among the qualities of the elements, the more downward is always the material, and the more upward is always the formal. But with respect to the compound elements, earth can be a form of water in a way that wasn't fully explained. But basically, between the cold and the hot is more formal. Between the wet and the dry, I forget. I guess the dry is more formal. But the dry subsists in both earth and... Oh, okay. Well, then if the dry is more formal, then earth participates of the formal nature by virtue of its dryness. But then why earth has that dryness, I guess it's just empirically given. So earth is a mixture of formal and material elements. So with respect to water, this actually kind of works. With respect to water, it's formal because it's dry, and dry is more formal than the wet. And then, yeah, with respect to air, it's not, because air is... it doesn't have... What's the other property that earth has that is, I guess, the cold? But air is also cold. And I'm not going to worry too much about it, but let's see what Aristotle himself does, because we're running back into the same seeming contradiction, where Aristotle asserts something that indicates that the upward should always be the formal, but elsewhere he said that both the middle and the extremity are formal with respect to intermediate elements. Let's read this sentence again. In like manner also in things pertaining to place, that which is upward belongs to the definite, and that which is downward to matter. Hence, in the matter itself of the heavy and the light, so far as it possesses such or such a quality in capacity, it is the matter of the heavy or the light. Okay, so the matter of the heavy or the light is, insofar as it has the quality such that it can act as the matter of the heavy or the light, it is the matter of the heavy or the light. All right. And the matter indeed is the same, but the essence is not the same. Just as that which may be diseased and that which may be restored to health are the same, but their essence is not the same, because neither is the essence the same of that which is diseased and that which is healthy. Hence, that which has a matter of such a kind is light, and is always upward, but that which has a contrary matter is heavy, and is always downward. And those things which have matters different from these, but which are so related to each other as the simply light and heavy, tend both upward and downward. Hence, both air and water have levity and gravity, and water indeed subsides under all things except earth, but air emerges above all things except fire. Since, however, there is one element alone which emerges above all things, and one which subsists under all things, it is necessary that there should be two others which subsist under some one element and emerge above some one. Hence, it is necessary that there should be as many matters as these, viz. 4, so as that there may be one matter which is common to all, especially if they are generated from each other, but that their essence should be different. For nothing hinders but that between contraries there may be one and many things, just as in colors. Okay, and there's not going to be a good break here. Oh, well, I mean, we could get to that. And let's go ahead and do it. We're going to go a little bit late here. So just as in colors, nothing hinders that between contraries there may be one and many things, just as in colors. So footnote. Aristotle, in his books on generation and corruption, multifariously shows that it is necessary there should be two intermediate elements, and that all of them should be four. For because the specific contrarieties are two, viz. Heat and cold, dryness and moisture, these being combined, it is necessary that all the elements produced from them should be four. He also proves this from the analogy of the qualities, from which the essence of each of the elements is derived, and farther still from a certain communion with each other, through which their mutation into each other becomes easy, in consequence of possessing a certain common symbol. This is also proved from that which is intermediate, having a similitude to each of the extremes. These, therefore, being two, it is likewise necessary that this medium should be twofold. But the divine Plato, also placing as extremes fire and earth, and asserting that the world so far as it is visible is from fire, but so far as it is tangible from earth, demonstrates that there are two media, for the universe being a solid, having its extremities solid, since the extremes ought to be conjoined from analogy in order to the generation of the universe, two analogous media were requisite, in order to complete the solid proportion. But in colors there are many media, for not only the pale is a medium between black and white, but also the yellow and the purple. Okay. Alright. For an intermediate, subsistence, and middle are predicated multifariously. Everything, therefore, that has levity and gravity has gravity in its own place, but earth has gravity in all places. But it has not levity except in those things above which it emerges. Hence, when they are removed, that tends downward, which is successive, air indeed to the place of water, but water to the place of earth. If, however, fire is removed, air will not be impelled upward to the place of fire, except by violence, just as water is drawn when there is one superficies, and any one may draw water upward with greater celerity than is the lation by which it tends downward. Nor does water pass into the place of air, except in the manner which has been just now mentioned. This, however, cannot take place in earth, because the superficies is not one. Hence, water indeed is drawn into an ignited vessel, but earth is not. But as earth, if the air were withdrawn, would not tend upward, so neither would fire tend downward, for it has not any gravity in its own place, as neither has earth any levity. But the two other elements would tend downward, if that which is beneath were withdrawn, because that is simply heavy which is placed under all things. But that which is relatively heavy tends to its own place, or to the place of those things above which it emerges through a similitude of matter. Okay. That it is necessary, however, to make equal differences in them is evident, for if there is one matter of all things, as for instance either a vacuum or a plenum, or magnitude or triangles, as Plato says, either all things will be impelled upward, or all things will be impelled downward, and there will be no longer another lation. So there has to be a difference in matter, otherwise everything will all move in one direction. So Aristotle's trying to justify his theory of the elements by that explanatory superiority that he explains the upward and downward motion. Hence, there will be nothing simply light if all things rather tend downward, because they are composed from larger bodies, or from a greater number, or because they are full. But we see this, and it has been demonstrated, that bodies similarly and everywhere always tend downward and upward. If, however, there is a vacuum, or anything of this kind, that which always tends upward will not be that which always tends downward. Some also of the intermediate bodies will tend downward with greater celerity than earth. For in a great quantity of air, there will be more triangles, or solids, or atoms. No part of air, however, appears to tend downward. The like also will take place in that which is light, if anyone makes it to exceed in matter. But if there are two intermediate elements, how will those things be affected which air and water affect? For instance, if someone should say there is a vacuum and a plenum, fire therefore will be a vacuum, and hence it tends upward, but earth will be a plenum, and therefore it tends downward. Air also will have more of fire, and water of earth. For there will be some water which has more of fire than a little air, and a great quantity of air which has more of earth than a little water. Hence it will be requisite that a certain multitude of air should more swiftly tend downward than a little water. This, however, never appears to take place anywhere. It is necessary, therefore, that as fire tends upward, because according to them it has a vacuum, but other things do not, and as earth tends downward because it has a plenum, in like manner air tends to its own place and is situated above water because it has a certain proper difference, and water for the same reason tends downward. But if both were one certain thing, or two things, and both were inherent in each, there would be a certain multitude in each, by which water will exceed a little air in a tendency upward, and air water in a tendency downward, as has been frequently observed. Okay, so we can't have one universal principle, or it's just the density of the things, because then, well, a giant rarefied body will have more of that which tends downward still than a small condensed body. And yet, in reality, a small condensed body sinks faster than a large rarefied body. And I'm surprised there's no footnote on that last sec. That was a lot of Aristotle with no note. So that's all right. Let's preview what the next one is going to be. The next dogma that particularly demands our attention is the perpetuity of generation and its being circularly infinite. So the cycle of generation. Okay, so we will come back to this soon. Any thoughts on the reading today that we want to mention? Okay, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here then.